All right, here is my do's and don'ts for short answer. So some do's is make the instruction clear and the wording clear with your questions that you're asking your students to do. You do not want your students to feel confused by what you are asking. Then don't forget to align your questions with your learning objective from the beginning of the lesson. Be flexible with your answers. Some students may struggle with answering certain questions, so having flexibility in grading them and seeing their thought process is very important within these questions. And then have a maximum possibly with words so students don't overwrite um, on the question. And then some don'ts is avoid vague questions. Like I said before, you want your students to understand what you are questioning or what question you're asking. And then do not grade specifically on the length. Some students may be able to get their thought process done in one sentence, or other students may need multiple, or not multiple, but a couple more. So do not just grade on length. And then also, do not ask tricky questions. You do not want your students to think they're being tricked, or having vague questions can confuse them too. And then do not dock students on minor errors such as capitalization, punctuation, and and sentence structure. Focus more on the details and knowledge that the student is giving off rather than their minor errors. So only dock them a little bit for that, but it's all about in the content rather than punctuation. All right, here's my do's and my don'ts for essay questions. So, with essay questions, have clear prompts, so clear questions. Use open ended questions. You want your students to be able to reflect and write a lot of information from this question. So, make it open ended where they can choose the direction of what they want to talk about or write about. And then have clear expectations of what you want from your students. Do you want them to go off more of their opinion, or do you want it to be more facts based? And then provide a grading rubric along with that so students know what the requirements are for this assessment or essay question. And then make the information relevant or the question relevant to the objective from the beginning of the lesson. Have students provide evidence or examples of their thought process to help support their claim. And then set a word count so students aren't overwriting. It can be a little difficult because some students might end up going down a different route than what they were not supposed to. So having that word count can help just keep everything compacted together. And then, like I said, make sure to state whether if you want more facts or opinion based. Look for capitalization, sentence structures, spelling, punctuation, and paragraph structure. You still want those key details graded on, but not as harsh as the content that's in the information. And then to make sure that the essays are relevant to what the students are being asked of, and then provide reasoning for the grade you give them. You want your students to learn from the input you give back to them. And then some don'ts is do not have vague questions that can confuse the students. They may write about the wrong thing that what you're asking. So make sure the question is clear and concise. And then do not ask for too much in one question. Asking for too much can confuse them, number one, and that's when they start missing errors and start answering only part of the question. And then do not use questions that are simple, such as yes and no. You want questions that are more in depth. And then avoid sensitive topics. This can bring up some issues within some classes, and you just don't want to go down that route necessarily, unless if it is for that certain assignment that you're completing, such as a debate in history class. And then do not dock students for their personal opinion if they do provide that in their paragraph. So do not dock them for writing what they think, because that is important to see what students think of a certain topic. And then once again, allow flexibility with your grading. Like I said, it is good to look for capitalization, punctuation, and all those details, but not grade majorly in that. Grade on the content of what the students were writing.
Here are the do's and don'ts for the true and false assessments. So, what we do want to do is create questions that have an objective answer. You don't want to create questions that are kind of subjective or could be this answer and could also be this answer. You want to create questions that have an objective one answer for students to know. Next, you want to create questions that align with the objective or standard. So you just want this to be relevant to what you're teaching, what the lesson is that you are on, what you need students to understand. You want the true and false assessments to be aligned to that standard or to that lesson. Next is to have a balanced number of true and false questions. You don't want all true or all false. You want them to be kind of balanced so that students actually have to think about things and recognize whether or not they're true or false. And the last one for the do's is to create clear and concise statements. You don't want to create super long statements where the students have to think about multiple aspects of whether or not the statement is true or false. You want it to be clear, to the point, and not super long statements. And moving on to the do nots of true and false assessments. You don't want to create questions that are subjective, so if they could have multiple answers, like I stated for the do's, you want them to be objective and have a clear, concise answer. Next, you want to avoid using confusing wording such as double negatives. So, for example, it is un it is not untrue that the sky is blue. That like see how there's like not and untrue? That type of stuff sounds really confusing and it can be hard for students, even teachers to understand the kind of wording. So you want to avoid double negatives and any kind of confusing wordings. Next, you don't want to rely on this type of assessment to provide 100% accurate information of whether or not your students completely understand the material that was learned. Obviously, there's a 50-50 chance that your students could be guessing the correct answer. So try not to rely solely on just true and false questions to provide the information of whether or not your students have learned. And for the last one, kind of piggybacking off of what I just said, is that we don't want to solely use this as our only form of assessment. We want to create differentiation within our assessments, so providing essay questions, short answers, multiple choice, selected response ones, all of those help to indicate whether students are learning and understanding the material that we are teaching them.
Here are some of the do's and don'ts when it comes to multiple choice questions and assessments. So, first with the do's, you want to align with your learning objectives, which seems very straightforward and very simple, as you should do that with every type of question. You need to use clear and concise wording. You don't want your multiple choice questions to be very long. You want to provide one clear, correct answer. So you don't want to have your students choosing between B or C and sitting there for 5 minutes on that question, not knowing whether it's B or C because the answers are so similar and it could be either one. You want to include plausible distractors, which just means that if your question is about sports, you want all of your options to be about sports with one clear cut answer. You don't want one option to be sports, and that's your correct answer, and then the other three to be about cooking, farming, and dinosaurs. You want them all to have to relate to your question. So students have to choose and think a little bit on the multiple choice question. You want to vary the position of the correct answer, which means don't put B every time, don't put C every time, don't do A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D all the way through. Review for bias, which is actually very important. You're going to have multiple choice questions that may be biased towards a certain group of people or something that people do. So just remember that you're going to have students from all walks of life. So just keep it as bias free as possible. Provide enough options. Usually with most multiple choice questions I've seen, there's 4 choices. Sometimes there's 5 or more. But usually around that 4 to 5 mark is going to be enough and not too many. And then avoid negatively worded questions. So if you're saying which of the following is not true, make sure your students know that you're wanting what is not true. So maybe put in all caps the word not. Some of the don'ts: don't use tricky questions. This one's kind of simple, but you're not here to trick your students with your multiple choice questions. Don't use all of the above or none of the above frequently. You can do that once in a while, but if you use that too often, it starts to become a problem. Don't overuse exact phrases from the text. Try and make your own. Summarize from the text. Don't make your distractors too obviously incorrect. Like I said with the do's, make sure that your distractors relate to the question that you're trying to do. Don't test trivial facts. Don't use complex grammar. The really multiple choice questions are supposed to be more short, simple, and sweet because you're only choosing that one box. You're not choosing or you're not writing an essay where students can give their own opinion. Don't test more than one concept per question. So don't try and test two different sections with one question. Keep it one question for this part, one for that part. And then don't create negative consequences for guessing, which just means, if students are trying their best, do not punish them for trying to get the right answer. Here are some of the do's and don'ts for matching questions on assessments. So, first off, with the do's, ensure clear instructions and make sure your students know what they are matching together. Keep the number of options manageable. Don't have your students try and match 25 words to 25 sentences. Keep it to a good number, such as 10. Vary the number of items in each column. So if you have 10 in one column, maybe put 12 in the other so students can't get down to the last two or three and just use process of elimination. That way it actually makes them think a little harder and have to rule some out. Focus on the important content. Don't make your matching questions about little details that students probably didn't pick up on during your lessons. Use short, concise items, which kind of goes back to the important content. Arrange items logically. So that can either be having one of your columns in alphabetical order or by certain names, etc. And then review for ambiguity, which just means to make sure that each um, item has exactly one pair. Don't make it so if you have to match a word to a sentence, that one of your words can be used in multiple sentences. So some of the don'ts: don't use too many matching pairs. Like I had mentioned in the do's, keep it to a limited number. Don't include trivial or irrelevant matches. Make sure all your matches are proper and they make sense. Don't make the answer choices too obvious. You still want your students to have to work a little bit and have it be a little difficult on your students. Don't use ambiguous terms or phrases, which just means make sure that two answers can't match with one choice or vice versa. Don't allow for process of elimination, which just means to vary your columns.